Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Region 10 chapters of HFMA. The topic for today's webinar is why you got hacked and how to make sure it doesn't happen again. I'd like to welcome today's guest presenter. We have Kevin Villanueva, who's a partner at Moss Adams IT Consulting Group, and he leads the firm's cybersecurity consulting practice. He's been consulting since 2002 and has over 20 years experience in information technology. Kevin's practice areas are HIPAA and high trust assessments, PCI DSS, cybersecurity assessments and audits, penetration testing, and disaster recovery planning. He has served as technical security counsel for hundreds of cybersecurity and risk assessment engagements over his career. So without further delay, I'll hand the call over to today's guest presenter. Kevin, please go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you, Nikki, and good afternoon to everybody, all the attendees out there. Thank you for joining us this afternoon on this presentation. So I want to make sure that, coming out of this this webcast, that we meet some certain learning objectives. So hopefully by the end, you'll learn the latest ways that cyber attacks are used to gain access to data and assets and how to successfully circumvent these attacks. Hopefully you'll understand the threat vectors for criminal cyber activity and how you can protect your IT environment and data and minimize the threat of being hacked. And then also have a broader knowledge of third-party risks around the Internet of Things or IoT, and also best practices in general on how to protect your data. And we're going to do this when I go through some of the different attack vectors or attack methods. I'll go over the administrative and technical controls to implement to bolster your defenses. So quickly, the agenda, really, I'll start off talking about the state of cybersecurity. I think today, cybersecurity is such a pertinent topic. I mean, I think we hear about a cyber breach or a data security breach almost every week in the media in recent days. We'll talk about the IT threat vectors, the methods that cyber criminals and attackers use for actually getting access to your network and data. And then we'll talk about the cybersecurity best practices for each method, and then hopefully at the end we'll have about roughly 5 to 10 minutes for questions. So I always like to start off with kind of the state of cybersecurity, and so I pulled out a number of different statistics from a couple of websites that I follow, particularly the Breach Level Index. They've been keeping track of data record losses and thefts worldwide since 2013. So since 2013, and this information was as of March of this year, roughly 9.7 billion data records were stolen or lost worldwide since 2013, and that's really 5 short years ago. And that is just a staggering number, and it shows just how cybersecurity in general. A lot of organizations, a lot of trusted organizations like Equifax, for example, some of the government agencies that have been attacked, including the NSA. They obviously have some work to do in terms of shoring up their network defenses. Over 5 million records are breached every day, and again, that's just a staggering number. I think about the 2 biggest attacks in 2017, ransomware attacks, the WannaCry and Petya and NotPetya. These vulnerabilities actually exploited an unpatched system, so a system that hasn't been patched with the latest software update that allowed the ransomware to actually impact a lot of different companies, including the British health system, the Maersk shipping line, amongst other companies in the European Union. So that was a very devastating ransomware attack that could have been avoided if systems were patched with the available patch that actually came out 3 months earlier. We're going to see ransomware attacks increase in 2018. In fact, we're going to see more of it based on ransomware as a service, or RAS. And the way this works is, I'm sure a lot of you probably use cloud-based services like software as a service applications. Now they're offering ransomware as a service, where you can actually pay a cyber criminal money to actually, or actually in Bitcoin rather, you can actually pay them in Bitcoin to actually develop a ransomware virus for you and actually launch it for you at particular targets of your choosing. And they'll just take a 10% commission on whatever the ransom that's collected, and that's going to be their fee. But, you know, ransomware as a service, we're going to see a lot of that, I think, in this year. The average cost of a data breach has actually gone down. So in this information came from a study by the Ponemon Institute, the 2017 Data Breach Investigation Report. Actually, I'm sorry, the cost of a data breach study. They did it in conjunction with IBM. It actually went down from $4 million per data breach in 2016 down to $3.62 million. So I'm not too sure if that means, you know, we're just getting attacked so much that we're just getting better at defending or recovering from a data breach, but actually that's a good sign. So a little bit less in 2017 at $3.62 million per breach. The cost of global cost of cybercrime in 2017, this one actually came from the data breach investigation report, is expected to be $600 billion. I've actually read some other studies that estimate by 2019 or next year that it's going to hit $2 trillion worldwide. You know, I guess depending on what you read, that could be a staggering number at $600 billion or just something unimaginable like $2 trillion, but it's a problem nonetheless. In 2017, just on U.S. Data breach statistics here, you know, roughly 1,500, almost 1,600 data breaches were reported in the U.S. last year. That's just the ones that we know about. Think about all the data breaches that don't get reported and don't get recorded. Of those attacks, of those data breaches, 178 million records were affected. I actually think this information was taken a little bit earlier in the year, probably came out in around September of last year and after the Equifax breach and then before the Uber breach, because I think that 178 million number actually is a little bit low, because I think Equifax affected about 147 million records, whereas the Uber breach in November of 2017, that impacted, I think, around 56 million. So certainly a lower number there. You know, of the 5 industry sectors that the Identity Theft Resource Center tracks as far as breaches, the business category topped the list for the 3rd year in a row, followed by healthcare and financial sectors. In fact, I think healthcare was around 24% of the breaches that took place in 2017. Hacking or really external attacks that includes phishing, ransomware, or malware infection, and credit card skimming, that was really the primary method of attack used in almost 60% of all the breaches. So who's typically behind all these breaches? Well, 75% is perpetrated by outsiders, so those unconnected to the organization, the victim organization. However, 25% involved internal attackers, or you know, individuals who may not have known that they're accessing information in an unauthorized manner or in a malicious manner. So that could be even our own employees. As far as the tactics, you know, hacking was generally the preferred method of choice. Again, that includes phishing, ransomware infection, injection of malware, etc. And then also malware exclusively. Using malware exclusively was another tactic that was largely used. So why the surge in attacks, especially in the last, you know, few years? Well, you know, I think about, you know, being IT just even as little as 10 years ago, and the attack vectors have become much more amplified. And I'll talk about what that means when I talk about these different attack vectors. But they're more there's more access, more ingress points to an organization's network and systems than there were, you know, I want to say like, you know, 10 years ago. Attackers today, they're also more sophisticated, they're better funded, and the attacks are usually multifaceted. Like, you know, attacks can come really via your mobile device, you know, not only your traditional workstation or your laptop, but it can come through your mobile device, you know, maybe a third-party vendor that you're using that has connectivity to your network. So we're just seeing a lot of different attack vectors, and there's, again, more resources at attackers' disposal. I mean, I talked about the ransomware as a service now that you can actually get to by going to the dark web and actually engaging a cyber criminal to actually do that type of development work for you. Social engineering attacks, those are still, a lot of the preferred ways a cyber criminal will try to get access to your network is through social engineering. And I'll talk about this a little bit more next, but social engineering, that includes phishing attacks, CEO fraud or whaling attacks, phone-based impersonation, also known as vishing, and then also physical site penetration testing as well. Social engineering is a lot easier for an attacker to take advantage of than actually trying to bang away at their keyboard trying to get into like a web server or a firewall to try to get access to your network. So, why hack a system, which is a lower probability play for an attacker, when you can hack a person or take advantage of a person's inherent desire to help other people. Again, there's more ingress points in the network, including mobile and IoT devices as attack vectors. We'll go into that a little bit later. And then, again, just the ransomware and the surge of ransomware attacks. It's been easy money for a lot of cyber criminals. In fact, I think from the Petya and not Petya and WannaCry attacks, those were easily several tens of millions of dollars that were essentially, as far as like a collective ransomware amounts, easily tens of millions of dollars for those entities that actually paid the ransom. So it's easy money, and it's easy to initiate a ransomware attack at a lot of different targets. So why is this so profitable? Well, the price of your data, and I got this information ironically from an article put out by Experian. But a social security number on the dark web, on the black market, typically goes for around $1. If you have more information like a driver's license number, that's actually going for $20 on the dark web. Payment card numbers, those are still attractive to cyber criminals, even though it's a lot easier to essentially disable a card or cancel a card with your bank. But those are still going for like $5 to $110. You must have your name, the type of card it is, like Visa, MasterCard, the expiration date, and of course the CCV code on the back. However, if you have a payment card with full information or a lot more complete information about the victim cardholder, such as their date of birth, it might also come with their social security number, their address. More information like that will actually fetch you $30 per payment card account. If you have a PayPal account with a balance in there, that could go anywhere from $20 to $200. So if you regularly use PayPal for transferring funds, again, if it maintains a certain balance, like I think on the higher end, if it's like over $8,000, then you're gonna, that type of account will fetch you $200 on the black market. However, I guess the holy grail of personal data is the medical record, and on the dark web, that's going anywhere between $1 to $1,000 per record. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense because when you get a medical record started with a provider, you're providing really a lot of information. So not only things like your social security number, but you could be including like payment card information, your employer information, as well as insurance information, of course. This is like prime stuff for an attacker to use for identity theft, maybe filing false tax returns, maybe insurance fraud. And so really the medical record is kind of the holy grail for personal data amongst cyber criminals trying to get access to your data. I mentioned earlier about just the different cyber threat vectors that are prevalent in today's network environment. So not only do you have malware, traditional viruses or internet worms that would afflict a target system, but you also have like email, mobile devices. Again, I mentioned the phone attacks, phone-based impersonation or vishing, as well as vulnerabilities with third parties. And I think now we're actually seeing IoT devices or Internet of Things type of devices being used attack vectors, and I'll talk about those in a little bit more depth later on in the presentation. But we're now seeing, just multiple ingress points to a target organization just to get access to your network, access to specific systems, all for the goal of getting personal data or sensitive data. So, why do some of these organizations get hacked into? Well, one of the things, of course, is just susceptibility to social engineering. I love this quote: "Amateurs hack systems, professionals hack people." It's whoever said it first, it's unknown, but I look at this quote and I think about a famous hacker. He's Kevin Mitnick. And now he's a security consultant today, but back in the 80s, he was probably the most notorious hacker around. And the way he got into systems owned by Pac Bell, DEC Corporation, and other big Fortune 500 companies, he actually didn't do it through a computer, but what he did was he actually utilized phone calls or impersonation. So he would actually leverage social engineering more than actually computer hacking, and he was very good at it. I mean, he was able to essentially impersonate employees in order to find out who is working at what time, and just kind of getting little bits of pieces of information so that he can formulate a larger type of attack, and he was very good at it. So social engineering, the art of manipulating people and performing actions or divulging confidential information. These techniques that I mentioned before, email phishing, social networks, vishing, and then physical site access are all techniques that cyber criminals use and take advantage of to get an individual to maybe click on an infected link, or maybe download some infected software to install malware like ransomware, for example. And social engineering in general preys on the natural inclination to trust and help others. So I'm sure all of you have been in some type of situation where you might be, going into a building, and the individual behind you has carrying around a heavy box or maybe a bunch of bags where they can't really hold the door open. And so, you being the nice person you are, would hold the door open or hold the elevator open. I mean, it's that type of demeanor that cyber criminals certainly prey upon, just our willingness and openness to trust and help others. And that's what they really bank on in terms of doing social engineering type of attacks. So maybe some of you have received this type of phishing email lately, especially around this time where we're already a little bit past the tax season here. But this actually is a pretty good phishing email example. This one, if you can read it, it's basically saying to the taxpayer that they have a refund coming to them in roughly about $320. And so they're asking the victim to get started with processing their excess payments so that they can get that refund. And they have a link, a get started link over here to actually click on. However, if you hover over that link, you're going to see that that get started link actually goes to carybaptist.org.uk. So someplace in the UK where you would get diverted to, even though obviously the IRS is a US-based institution. And so I find that this is actually a really good example. It's really it doesn't have the usual grammar or spelling errors that a lot of the earlier phishing emails used to have, but this one's a very polished one. So even ones that look legitimate, you still have to kind of be wary of. So just by hovering over the hyperlink in the email will actually tell you where you're really going, or where the real destination is. So phishing is it's an email fraud method in which the perpetrator sends out a legitimate-looking email in an attempt to gather personal and financial information from recipients. So typically, it involves a problem and requiring you to take immediate action. So like that email before, email example, it's asking you to, hey, click here so we can actually get your refund started and get the ball rolling as far as getting you your tax refund. And so it's going to ask you to go to a site and verify information. So that could lead up to you entering your social security number, your address, other information like your employer perhaps. And so that type of personal information is what these cyber criminals bank on as far as getting with this phishing type of attack. There's three basic types of phishing attacks. One's blanket, or really kind of targeting the entire organization, not any specific groups, but really kind of just throwing it all out there in terms of an email blast. Spear phishing, which targets more, targeting specific departments or individuals. So those targets could be personnel and finance, customer service, HR, IT, and executive management. And then whaling, which is also known as CEO fraud. So these types of phishing emails that target CEOs or CFOs, asking for authorization for a wire transfer or a transfer of goods those types of attacks are typically called whaling attacks because they're usually aimed at those individuals that maybe in accounting or executive management that can authorize the release of funds or goods. So phishing protection, some of the things that definitely you should be doing anyway amongst your IT team as far as like technical controls include like having antivirus and spam filtering on email servers. So this is this is pretty much like cybersecurity 101 from an IT standpoint, because having the antivirus on your email servers will make sure that those emails that might come with an infected attachment, like an infected Word doc or an Excel spreadsheet that could trigger the ransomware, that actually gets stripped off or blocked entirely. So it's always good to have that on your email servers. Antivirus or endpoint protection software on your workstations is always a good thing to do. Again, that's pretty basic because if something gets through your email servers or some other way, at least you have antivirus controls on your workstation, on your laptop to actually see if indeed that's a malicious code that's getting installed. Adequately patch workstations so that malware doesn't spread. Again, I talked about the Petya, not Petya, and WannaCry ransomwares from earlier last year, how those attacks could have been avoided if, again, the servers were patched with that software update that was actually available 3 months before in March of 2017. Register all company domains that are slightly different from the actual company domain. So cyber criminals are actually getting more creative in how they try to trick individuals to actually trigger a social engineering attack. And what they're doing now is an attack called typo squatting. So, for example, if you try to go to like Amazon.com, but you do it really fast and you miss the O in .com, so you just do Amazon.cm, that type of domain is actually maybe registered to a cyber criminal. So they bank on you going to an infected website just because you typed the domain name actually incorrectly or missed the letters, for example. So attackers are actually registering these false domains in order to trick more individuals and do more widespread damage that way. Some of the administrative controls around phishing protection is having a robust security awareness training program. I think this is really essential for a cybersecurity awareness program. Making sure that security awareness training program actually goes over how to recognize phishing email, how to train your users to not click on embedded links without checking first, and then also testing your users periodically. So, we sometimes get engaged as well as some of our clients do it internally, but really kind of simulating phishing attacks against their own employees. If you can do that on a monthly basis and actually see which groups or which maybe group of individuals might be more susceptible to a phishing attack, that's going to give you some insight as far as where you might need to spend some more of your IT dollars or your training dollars to make sure you don't fall subject or an employee doesn't fall subject to some type of phishing attack. Require proper documentation and approvals for all wire transfers. So in the event that, one of your employees, perhaps in accounting and finance, they do get those phishing attacks asking for a wire transfer, make sure that you have good internal controls in place that require specific approvals to be met before that wire transfer is actually initiated. And I think that's just common internal controls that, hopefully is just routine business operations for a lot of you. Immediately report any suspicious emails to your IT department. They can usually add, the email domain to a system that actually blocks any emails from that domain. So if it is a suspicious email, then, certainly get your IT department involved, because they're going to know how to block those emails in the future. Another way, we get attacked is through insufficient ransomware security. So, ransomware, it's a type of malware that attempts to extort money from a computer user by infecting and taking control of the victim's machine or the files or documents stored on it. However, the types of ransomware today is a lot more destructive, in that not only will it infect the immediate machine, the victim's machine, but it's also meant to propagate through your network. So it's actually looking for other machines and using the original victim machine as a jump-off point to infect other systems on your network. And this is where, you can really get in a lot of trouble and, really adversely impacted as a result. Typically, the ransomware will either lock the computer, prevent normal usage, or encrypt the documents. The victim either pays the ransom or has to restore the data from backup media. And then, again, I talked about the ransomware as a service at the beginning of the presentation, about how that's becoming more and more of a cyber criminal's, choice for deploying ransomware. There was a derivative of the SamSam ransomware called Popcorn Time, and this one was discovered last year. And basically, what Popcorn Time, what this ransomware did is, after it infected the original victim's computer, the attacker would essentially say to the victim to will actually offer to not or actually provide the decryption key to the original victim's machine only if the victim infects two other organizations with the ransomware. So it is really truly an evil ransomware, in that it's enticing the original victim to infect other organizations, and essentially helping that ransomware propagate to other victim organizations. So, they're becoming more and more creative. Certainly, cyber criminals becoming more and more creative in how they can propagate and perpetuate their ransomware attacks. So how does ransomware get installed? Well, it's usually installed when you do one of the following. So, again, you open up a malicious email attachment, like an XLS or Excel file that might have macros enabled. That could trigger a ransomware to getting installed on your machine. You might click on a malicious link inside of an email or instant message, or even on a social networking site that might divert you to an infected web page. You might visit a malicious or infected site. A lot of cyber criminals like to embed their ransomware into an infected website. So once you browse to it, it kind of triggers itself and gets installed in the background. You might download and install an infected application. This is especially the case if you're maybe taking advantage of some offer on social media that you see, where you might be downloading a game, or there's an offer to download a game that might actually be ransomware in disguise, or may install ransomware in the background as you're installing the game itself. Once infected, the attacker's command and control system creates the encryption key. So there is a communication back to the cyber criminal's machine to create the encryption and decryption keys once that ransomware does get installed on your machine. The files are typically encrypted with AES 256-bit encryption, which is essentially the strongest encryption, commercial encryption out there that's offered. And then what's interesting is the static payment duration is established before increasing the amount of the ransom. So you actually get a couple of options. You can either pay the ransom right away and save your files, or you can actually, or if you wait it out, then a deadline might come and go where if you don't hit the original deadline of paying the ransom, then the cost of the ransom goes up. After a set amount of days. So usually, ransomware cyber criminals will give you about a week to pay the ransom. Around the fourth or fifth day, they'll say if you don't pay by this day, then it's going to go up as far as getting the decryption key. And then at the end of the seventh day, you lose your files. So there's always that option as well, but both of them very terrible. Ransomware protection. So again, I think a lot of you have heard this, but backup is critical. Having a good, sound backup strategy is critical. In fact, you should match your backup strategy with how valuable your data is, so that you're trying to protect. So, if you think you cannot be without your database, without your data for longer than an hour, then you should have a backup strategy to match that. You should be doing snapshot backups, every hour, at least. If you think you can afford to lose a day's worth of data, then maybe you only do nightly backups. Always, try to protect yourself with an offline copy, because if you get infected with ransomware and it tries to propagate through the rest of your network, your backup server that may house previous backup sets could get infected, and then as a result, you're gonna have infected backups that you will not be able to restore from, because they're not going to be any of use to you. Similarly, if you use online cloud backups, those could actually take a significantly longer time to download if you have to restore from one of those cloud-based services, especially if you have a small internet pipe, or a small connection to the internet that doesn't have a very high download speed. So if you think about the terabytes of data that you may need to restore if you ever get affected by ransomware, again, think about how long it's going to take to restore if you're trying to restore from a cloud-based backup service. Implement internet content scanning and spam filtering on mail servers, so similar to protecting against phishing attacks. You should do that to protect against ransomware. Using antivirus or endpoint protection on your workstations and making sure that it's updated constantly. Again, that's kind of cybersecurity 101. And then adequately patch systems so that malware doesn't spread. Administrative, it's going to be very similar, to protecting yourself against phishing. Ensure your personnel are trained to recognize phishing scams and other social engineering attacks, because, again, that's really kind of the number one way that ransomware attacks start, is usually with that fake email or that phishing attack. Have an incident response plan and a disaster recovery plan in place, and test it. I think a lot of our clients, when we actually do a cybersecurity assessment, we find that they might have an incident response plan, or they might have a disaster recovery plan in place, but they don't test it. And so when the time comes when they actually do have to recover or respond to an incident, individuals don't know what roles and responsibilities they have during the incident response effort, and whether or not they're following the right protocols in terms of addressing the incident, enabling breach protection to essentially stop the attack from propagating more or spreading more throughout the environment, and then they don't know their breach notification responsibilities. So, with HIPAA and also specific state laws that require notification of the impacted individuals within 72 hours, for example. A lot of our clients don't automatically recognize that, or don't know that that needs to happen. One of the other things that cybersecurity professionals say is do not pay the ransom, because, again, there's no guarantee that once you pay the ransom that the cyber criminal will provide you with the decryption key. A lot of the times there might be already a key that exists. I went to a cybersecurity related conference a few years ago, and they had an FBI agent talking about why a victim shouldn't pay the ransom amount, and it's typically because the FBI investigates so many of these ransomware attacks that a lot of the times they keep track of the key or the encryption key that gets used for specific types of ransomware strains. So if it's a common strain, then it's something that maybe the FBI can help with a decryption key. But again, you kind of have to weigh the cost of, do you go to the FBI, asking for their help, and who knows when they'll get back to you. Hopefully it'll be soon, but, you have to kind of weigh that time against what time or how long it's going to take you to actually restore your system, recover your system, and then also restore data, because the latter might take a lot less time. Other things that really we're hearing as far as recovery from a cyber attack is like the lack of due diligence with third-party service providers, and I think we often overlook this type of threat or threat vector. Some examples of third-party service providers you guys might be familiar with include like Google Docs, Salesforce, Gmail, NetSuite. Those are all examples of software as a service. You have platform as a service providers in Microsoft Azure and App Engine. That's really geared toward developers. And then infrastructure as a service, such as Amazon Web Services or Backspace.com. Some of these might host your systems, for example, in addition to what you have in your own data center and server room. So some of the third-party risks, again, there's some other services like online backup services I mentioned earlier, system and network monitoring services, firewall monitoring, payroll services, even attorneys and accountants kind of fall into this category as far as potential risk areas. Is the fact that some third-party risks, you're ceding control of your data. There's always that concern of once it's in the third-party service provider's hands, how do we know that it's going to be secure and that it's going to be my data in the end, and it's going to be kept safe and sound. The third-party provider, they may not have the solid controls in place for redundancy or access control or disaster recovery or monitoring that you might expect. The vendor may not be compliant with regulations or industry requirements or business agreements. So, for example, if you have to, in complying with HIPAA, you have to make sure that the vendor also is complying with HIPAA. If for example, if they're handling EPHI, electronic protected health information on your behalf, they should also be compliant with HIPAA because there's that downstream of responsibility as a business associate. With these third parties, you may wonder if they replicate data beyond U.S. borders. Maybe some business agreements prohibit data from leaving U.S. borders. And also you got to wonder about the financial solvency, especially if you go with a smaller third-party service provider, just making sure that they're actually going to be around in 5 to 10 years or however long you need them to be to essentially make sure that you get your data back should the vendor go out of business. So there's a lot of risk there with third parties that need to be considered. Some of the third-party risk protection measures that should definitely take are, the technical areas is really understanding where responsibilities start and end for the vendor. I remember a few years ago we did a cybersecurity assessment for a transit agency. This transit agency used a third-party provider for essentially issuing bus tickets, and our client, the transit agency, was not clear on where their responsibilities end in terms of securing cardholder data or customer data, and where it began for that third-party vendor that actually issued the bus passes. And so knowing where your responsibilities start and end for securing sensitive data, that's going to be critical. Implement security controls for all third-party ingress points. So if you have third parties that do have access to your network or systems, make sure you have the appropriate security controls to limit their access, restrict their access to only what is needed, and also restrict the systems that they can actually get access to, as well as having those monitoring controls for monitoring their access. And that includes conducting regular log reviews. So, any activity that any third parties do while they're on your network, while they might be maintaining your system, that gets logged and actually reviewed once they're done. Some of the administrative third-party risk protections you should actually take as well is implement a vendor risk management policy and procedures. So have some type of formal protocol for actually bringing on or onboarding a vendor, a new vendor, and consider the risk that that vendor could present to the organization and to your data. Have language in an agreement about compliance requirements that must be met. So I mentioned earlier, for example, having a business associate agreement with a third-party service provider that handles EPHI on your behalf. That needs to be the certain clauses around complying with HIPAA, and then also the changes out of the High Tech Act and then the Omnibus Final Rule. Those need to be in there as far as formalized in the agreement. Insert a right to audit clause in the agreement, so that gives you the right to make sure that what they're telling you as far as the third party, what the third party is telling you in terms of their security controls are actually in place and they're designed appropriately for protecting your data and that they've been operating effectively. So having that right to audit clause is key. Review third-party attestation reports of controls annually. So a lot of third parties, especially data centers and service providers that provide like monitoring services or managed security services, they often have what's called a SOC audit, or essentially it's an audit, third-party attestation of their internal control structure. So that's one thing you should certainly get before engaging with the third party is that SOC audit. It's usually done on an annual basis, and that's going to give you a good idea about their hiring practices, whether or not their people are trained continually, their logical as well as physical controls, physical security controls that they have in place. And then, they'll also talk about things like, how often they back up data, for example, if they're doing that for you. And then, if they are also involved with patching your systems, then, they'll have controls around that as well. Other third-party audits like ISO 27001 audits or high trust audits, which is gaining traction amongst healthcare entities. It's more comprehensive than HIPAA, than just a HIPAA assessment or HIPAA audit, in that it goes beyond just looking at protections around EPHI or protected health information. It's really more comprehensive in looking at controls that are in place for protecting sensitive information in general. And then have a contingency plan in place if you need to terminate the agreement. So really having that backup plan in place if the third party is not performing as you would expect, that you actually can get your data back and that you have a plan B should you need to terminate your agreement with them. Other things is no strategy for securing the Internet of Things, or I like to call it the Internet of Threats. For those of you unfamiliar with IoT or the term, it's really kind of the, I want to call it like the ecosystem of connected devices that leverages sensors and other things like actuators to actually to trigger a certain action without requiring intervention by humans. So that's a kind of a long definition, but really what it comes down to is anything that's labeled smart. Like some of you might have smart conferencing systems in your organizations where you have a camera that follows you as you move along, or when somebody speaks up around the conference table, the camera might automatically zoom in on that individual. So you got like smart conferencing systems. You might have like vending machines that have sensors on them that will tell the vending machine operator that the machine is low on a certain product. So things like that use sensing technology to actually trigger an action. And again, anything labeled smart is considered an IoT device. Even things like your Apple Watch or your Google Glass, things like that would also qualify as an IoT device. So even those things in the consumer space. So depending on what you read, the growth expectancy of IoT is 50 billion connected devices by 2020. This is according to Cisco Systems, who conducted a study around IoT devices last year. Gartner's estimate is more like 26 billion. So I think maybe Cisco's a little bit more optimistic. They might have more skin in the game given that they are a product manufacturer But Gartner's estimate is more like 26 billion. So when you think about IoT, you're going to think about like the consumer demand for network connections and access to data will grow exponentially. So you're going to have all these different devices wanting to connect to the internet, connect to your network to gain access to data, and that's just kind of going to grow exponentially over the next couple of years, especially. One of this example of as far as like how these devices can actually be used as an attack vector or an ingress point is last year a North American-based casino, and the story doesn't disclose which casino, but it was a pretty large one. They had a showcase fish tank in their casino, and this fish tank had a sensor in there, an IoT network-connected device that actually monitored the water temperature. It monitored whether or not the fish needed to be fed, and so they had this device in there, and actually that device was used. That sensor device was actually used as an ingress point for a cyber criminal based in Finland. So the attacker actually hacked into that fish tank sensor, and then used that as an ingress point to actually try to propagate to additional areas of the network. In the end, that Finland-based cyber criminal was able to extract roughly 10 gigabytes of data. And I think if it's data like, for example, a player database, that's valuable information for a cyber criminal, because again, that information will likely have payment card information, personal information like social security number, as well as the player's address and other demographic information. So that was a pretty astonishing example of how IoT devices can be used as attack vectors that I thought was really interesting. Other things I just want to call out, some of the characteristics of IoT devices: limited processing power, sensor triggers, actuators, machine-to-machine communication. These are all things associated with IoT type of devices. Other examples here include like wireless security cameras, Fitbits and smartwatches, wireless HVAC systems, and then medical devices. We're seeing a lot of IoT devices, especially in healthcare. When I think about like biomed pumps, for example, that dispense drugs to patients, a lot of those devices are operated via IoT or just using sensor and actuator technologies. Some of the threats from IoT devices include just kind of a lack of security standards and practices. There's really no uniform, consistent body that actually governs the security over these types of devices, and there's no common set of standards that each of these manufacturers follow to make sure that these devices are secure. Disruption and denial of service. If you have a lot of these IoT devices on your network, think about they're also competing against your workstations, your mobile devices, your servers for network bandwidth. And so if you have a lot of these devices on your network, then actually they're going to take a good chunk of the traffic as well. Physical attacks on sections of a machine or device, again, because a lot of these devices are so system specific that they could actually be used, again, like an ingress point or an attack point for cyber criminals. And then there's privacy issues as well, especially if you're moving around sensitive data like protected health information. You usually want that information encrypted. However, a lot of these IoT devices do not have the processing power to encrypt data. They're just not built for that type of purpose, and as a result, a lot of them don't have the security controls necessary to make sure that privacy laws as well as data security regulations are maintained and complied with. So what do you do for IoT risk protection? Well, from a technical standpoint, really segmenting all of that IoT traffic from the rest of the corporate or network or business network via a firewall, a router, that's going to be a good start, because you separate that type of traffic, which is specialized and really used for one purpose. That's going to allow you to have more bandwidth for more of your corporate and business network, rather than having it flooded and deluged by employees' smart watches, for example, or traffic from smart TVs or your conferencing systems. Make sure to change default passwords and insecure settings. A lot of these devices, they get installed, but they get installed with default passwords still. And these things are just like any other server or workstation. If you set them up, make sure the default passwords are changed once they're configured. You got to keep the device's firmware up to date. So these are like traditional workstations or servers. The software needs to be kept up to date through regular software updates and patches. Encrypt data while in transit and while at rest if it's particularly sensitive. So again, I talked about protected health information. If it has the capability, certainly have the device encrypt the data while in transit, and then also while it's in rest, while it's sitting in a database. As far as administrative controls, institute a governance process when considering new IoT technology. So, as you're considering introducing more IoT technology in your environment, make sure it goes through that governance process so that you get to understand and talk about all the potential risk areas that an IoT device could be impacting. So definitely talk about the risks that new IoT technology will present if it is implemented into your IT environment. Develop a policy for regulating the use of consumer-based IoT devices. So, for example, I mentioned like Google Glass or Apple Watch, some of these other consumer-based devices. You might have a policy, prohibiting those types of devices because of the type of information that you handle, especially if they're used for potential data leakage purposes. So developing a policy around that regulates the use of those consumer-based IoT devices is pretty important. Leverage security guidance from authoritative sources like the NIST Cybersecurity for IoT program. So NIST stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They're really looked upon as an authoritative source for cybersecurity best practices. So this new document, this Cybersecurity for IoT program, will actually have a lot of good tips, a lot of good best practices for implementing IoT devices in your environment. So we have roughly 5 minutes, but I just want to kind of go over key takeaways. So again, just remember, any organization, regardless of size, is vulnerable to a breach. A cyber criminal will often look for low-hanging fruit, and that usually resides with, maybe smaller organizations that may not have the most sophisticated security controls to protect a customer's data. And so, regardless if you're big or small, you are a target for a cyber criminal who's looking for an easy catch. Cyber criminals continue to use evolving, more elaborate attacks to compromise vulnerabilities. We're seeing that now with the ransomware as a service type of attack that is going to become more and more prevalent, especially in 2018. Security awareness training is paramount. I mean, even addressing the threat of phishing and ransomware attacks, security awareness training will do will help thwart a lot of those types of attacks. If you have an end user community that knows and can recognize when those types of attacks are hitting them, that's going to be your best protection. Understand your exposure through a risk assessment. So especially if you're implementing IoT devices in your environment, going through that risk assessment process is key because it's going to kind of call out things that you should consider during the implementation and as you're using that IoT device where data could be at risk. Vendor management is a critical control requirement. So a lot of us are using third parties or cloud-based services. So really doing your due diligence on these vendors is going to be something that should be part of your cybersecurity program. Implement a governance process when considering new IoT devices in your environment, and then leverage guidance from cybersecurity best practices from NIST, ISO, the Center for Internet Security or CIS, and then also SANS, which is also a good resource for cybersecurity best practices. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Nikki. That's our presentation for today. Hopefully you guys learned a lot, and we can open it up for, I guess, a couple of questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Kevin. Great information. And before I take our question, just reminding everyone you can type them into the questions panel located to the right of your screen. So let's just jump right in. The first question is, how often should the security measures of third-party service providers be audited?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, typically if the third party service provider um, is if they have a SOC audit, for example, that I mentioned earlier, typically these audits are performed yearly. So every year around a specific time, they usually go through the SOC audit process, and it's during that time that a report is issued, and it's usually based on an annual basis. So they have an auditor come in, look at how specific controls, key controls were being administered, and whether or not they were operating effectively for the prior year. So it's typically on a yearly basis when a lot of these companies, these third-party providers, are audited, and I would agree with that. So if you have access to their SOC audit report and it's done on an annual basis, that's going to give you a good idea of what their controls are.
Okay, thank you. I love this next question. How can smaller organizations that may not have large budgets for IT really protect themselves from all of those cybersecurity threats that you mentioned?
Yeah, we deal with a lot of small entities, small clinics, physician groups, smaller entities like that may not have the budget, the huge IT budget that you seemingly think you need to have to protect your IT environment. I would say if I was to use my money on anything, it would be to educate the end user community on cyber threats. So again, having a security awareness program, a robust security awareness program where the end user is educated about cyber threats and how how they can protect themselves and protect the organization against those threats. I think that's probably the best and most effective use of a limited amount of money for cyber security protection. So again, yeah, just having a good, robust security awareness training program.
Great, and if I may add, I've even noticed some entities who would take this budget and not just let it reside in the IT, but perhaps roll it up into some type of continuity or disaster recovery budget because of the great amount of risk associated with it. So that's great. This is all great information. Thank you for that. All right, so it looks like we've exhausted the questions so far. If you think of something last minute, go ahead and shoot it in. But as we approach the top of the hour, I do want to take this time to thank our members and the healthcare community for joining the call. As you exit, you will be prompted with a survey, and we would appreciate you sharing your feedback about today's event as well as what kind of topics you're interested in seeing in future webinars. So thank you again to our guest presenter, Kevin Villanueva of Moss Adams. We are so grateful for you taking time to prepare this information, Kevin.
Thank you, Nikki. And I threw a lot out there, so hopefully you guys got a lot out of it and some good measures you can employ in your own environments.
Awesome.
Thank you.
All right. So on behalf of Region 10 chapters of HFMA, thank you again, everyone, for joining, and have a great afternoon.